I think World War II was really the turning point. A lot of Jews are serving as GIs in the army, and they are really forced to branch out a little bit in terms of the kind of foods that they eat. And there's this famous saying about eating ham for Uncle Sam. So even those who came from more traditional Jewish homes weren't able to keep kosher in the army. At the same time, they were also sharing their food that was sent to them from home. If you think about the famous sign in Katz's and other deli, send a salami to your boy in the army.
Right.
They were exposing the non-Jews in their platoons to Jewish food for the first time.
Welcome to 18 Jewish Foods, Culture and History in Kosher Bite-Sized Portions. This podcast tells the stories of iconic Jewish dishes, shedding light on the people who eat them. Here's your host, Joel Haber.
Welcome to the 10th episode of this podcast, which means I've made it to the halfway mark. I'm really happy you guys have all been checking it out, listening, whether it's you've listened to one or two episodes or all of the previous 9. I really appreciate it. Listenership has been growing, but I would like to make a request that if you've liked what you've heard so far, spread the word. Pass it on to others who might be interested. Tell people about the podcast. It would mean a lot to me, and I'd really appreciate it. Also, I should say that if you're not aware, every episode has full episode notes on my website, and there's a lot of interesting information and links. So I recommend checking out the episode notes at tasteofjew.com. On today's episode, we're going to be looking at pastrami. Pastrami is something interesting in that when people look at American-Jewish food, typically they think it's exactly what Ashkenazi food was in Europe. While it is true that American-Jewish food certainly traces its roots primarily to Ashkenazi food, it's not 100% the same as we're going to see with today's food. There were many original contributions that American Jewry made to its own cuisine rather than just cutting and pasting from what was eaten in Europe. So, what is pastrami exactly? To be specific, it is a type of preserved beef. It is brined first, meaning soaked in a saltwater brine. Then it is usually rubbed with spices and dry cured for a certain amount of time, and then it is smoked. So you have both the flavor of smoke and the flavor of the pickling spices that are on it. It's a really complex flavor, much more complex than many other such meats. And if you don't have all of these things, it's not really a pastrami, or at least not really an American-Jewish pastrami. Typically, there's one more stage where it is steamed before it is served, and that's actually a key finishing step. Now, I just made a distinction and said the American-Jewish pastrami, and that is because, as many know, pastrami can trace its roots back to Romania. And many will say, well, it's a Romanian food, not a Jewish food. And it is certainly related, but the American-Jewish deli pastrami is different than Romanian pastrami. In Romania, pastrama, as it's known, not pastrami, was in fact a preserved meat, preserved in a similar fashion with these multiple steps. However, there typically it was made or is made with lamb or goat or even pork. Jews in Romania most likely primarily used goose. Goose has been a beloved meat of Jews in many countries for quite a long time. But in America, it is almost always made with beef, and that beef is a specific cut. That cut of beef is known as the plate or the navel, or in Yiddish, dekel. It is stomach meat, very close to, like just behind the brisket. It was a relatively inexpensive cut of beef. It's a fatty meat, but one where the fat is actually marbled into the meat itself. And this is a key element. Probably originally, Romanian Jews in America were also making a goose pastrama, but goose was not something that was easily raised in cities such as New York. And so they found an inexpensive cut of beef and decided to apply that technique to this beef. So what we see is that pastrami is actually a method more than a food itself. Nobody knows exactly how or when or why the name pastrama turned into pastrami in America. The most quoted speculation is that it became pastrami because it sounded like salami, which was known as a deli meat. And so it probably just gradually became the accepted pronunciation there. We don't know with certainty, but that's certainly plausible. Gil Marx, in Encyclopedia of Jewish Food, also points out that American-Jewish pastrami was typically softer than Romanian pastrama because of the timing in which it was created. When American Jews in New York created this version of pastrami in the early 20th century, refrigeration existed. And so there was less need to preserve meat in the same way, and they could use a less salty brine, and that allowed the meat to be more tender. Now, if we're tracing the roots of pastrami, it may go even further back. A lot of sources will point to Ottoman or Armenian preserved meats known as pastirma or basturma. I would say that while clearly they share a linguistic heritage, and that is probably the linguistic precursor, they're clearly not the same food. Yes, they're both preserved meats. However, the pastirma or basturma was sliced and pressed to remove much of the liquid from inside, thus drying it, and then finished with a wet spice rub. So both are preserved meats, and probably that is the origin in some way of the name. However, the method of preservation is completely different, and rather than curing an entire cut, they are slicing it thin in order to press it and dry it out that way. So what is the origin of that American Jewish version? The most frequently repeated story is that a Lithuanian Jew named Susman Volk in New York City in 1887 had a butcher shop, and a friend or an acquaintance asked him if he could store a trunk in his basement while he returned to Romania for a number of months. And in exchange, he gave him his family's recipe for pastrami. Susman Volk then went and prepared this pastrami, and it became successful, so much so that within a year, he was able to move to a larger facility, large enough that he could put tables and chairs. And it became a sit-down eatery. Plus, it was either from his innovation or a suggestion from a customer that they take that pastrami and put it between slices of rye bread, thus creating the famous pastrami on rye sandwich. The source of this story comes from a granddaughter of Susman Volk named Patricia Volk. And in her book Stuffed, which is the story of her family's experiences in the deli business, she tells this story. This is a type of story that we have no way of proving or disproving, but there is a lot of culinary mythology in the world. I am in no way suggesting that this story is false. I would have no way of knowing. But it does sound a bit mythological and may not actually be the story, but it doesn't matter if it's the story, because what it indicates is that there is something significant that happened, a massive change, and likely Susman Volk was very much involved in that change. It is highly likely that he was the first to serve it in a sandwich, and even more likely that he was the first to have what grows into a sit-down delicatessen. So whether he was the first to have an American-Jewish style pastrami or somebody else was, isn't really the point. But certainly he plays a role in the development of the American-Jewish deli story, and that story is connected very much with pastrami. Now, that delicatessen also shows another difference of American Jewish cuisine as opposed to European Ashkenazi Jewish cuisine. In an American Jewish deli, you could find foods from all over. Corned beef traces its roots to Alsace-Lorraine, the heartland of Ashkenazi Jewry. Chopped liver, and typically chopped chicken liver, is more of an Eastern European food. You could get a Hungarian-style stuffed cabbage. Hot dogs, which are also an example of American Jewry modifying a food that they knew from Europe, is something that probably traces its roots back to Germany, but again is an American Jewish iteration of that food. I've actually written an article about that, which I'll link to in the episode notes. All of these different foods, side by side, from different parts of Europe, highlights the fact that in Europe, there wasn't a unified Ashkenazi cuisine. German Jews ate different things than Hungarian Jews, who ate different things from Russian Jews, who ate somewhat similar, but still different things from Polish Jews or Romanian Jews. But in America, all of those things coming together in one eatery helped to create a unified American Ashkenazi Jewish cuisine. Of all of those foods available in the Jewish deli, pastrami was the king, at least in New York City. And what this further shows is that the Romanian Jews, who were the ones who brought it or who introduced it to New York Jewish culture, they were a relatively small immigrant group among Ashkenazi Jews. And yet they made this outsized contribution. This shows how, in fact, the Ashkenazi Jews of America were a unified whole. They were American Jews of Ashkenazi descent. Pastrami became such a dominant food that we also see many variants. Los Angeles kosher delis introduced a food called the French dip. This is a French roll or a Kaiser roll that's kind of sliced in half, dipped in gravy, and then piled up with pastrami. So you have the pastrami on a different kind of bread and with gravy in it. In the book Save the Deli, David Sachs points out a variant that comes from Toronto, where their pastrami actually begins as a corned beef, a fully cured corned beef. It's then rubbed with spices and baked inside of an oven, but baked with water, so it's almost like a braising process to a degree. And Montreal is well known for what is called smoked meat. The main difference of that is that rather than using the navel, rather than using the decal, they're actually using the brisket. This might not seem like a big difference to some people, but there is a significant difference because the fat is different. In the navel, the fat is marbled in, whereas in brisket, it's less so. And so it is not as tender in many ways. And so there's a different consistency to that meat, and it's a different type of a food. All of these different variants, though, really indicates the prominence of pastrami as an American Jewish meat. To talk a little bit more about pastrami, I decided to interview Ted Merwin. Ted is a historian who wrote a book called Pastrami on Rye, an overstuffed history of the Jewish deli. How did you get into studying deli in America?
So I have a doctorate in theater from the City University of New York Graduate School, and my dissertation for my degree was about Jewish culture in New York in the 1920s, which is when the second generation of American Jews, the children of Jewish immigrants, were starting to become more part of the mainstream of American society, but still very much ensconced within a very Jewish world. And so I was writing about vaudeville routines and Broadway plays and silent films. But then when I finished writing the book, I realized that also a very common location in popular culture for Jewish life was the delicatessen.
When you wrote your book, what made you decide that pastrami specifically was the one to name the book for?
Although my book is not just about the deli in New York, a lot of it is about that. And the iconic Jewish deli sandwich in New York is the pastrami on rye. Not true in Chicago, for example, where corned beef is seen as like the most popular type of food that you order in a deli. But in New York, there was something iconic about pastrami.
And could you put your finger on what it was that made it that iconic dish?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure why. I mean, I think it is how things played out. I think that there is something special about pastrami in that it's taken to a higher level in some ways.
Takes more work to prepare than corned beef does.
So that could be part of it, about why it became something that became not just, I think, emblematic of Jewish life in New York, but really emblematic of New York.
Can you say anything about the similarities or differences between American Jewish pastrami and its precursors in Romania or elsewhere in Europe?
I think that any type of smoked and pickled meat that became part of the American Jewish diet started for the most part in America. I don't think these were foods that Jews really ate when they lived in the old country with any kind of regularity, because they tended to be extremely impoverished. And it was only when they came to the United States that they were really able to afford to eat meat. These were foods that were only consumed in small quantities, probably on special occasions, and they were delicacies. And that's how we got the whole concept of the delicatessen, is really a place where luxurious kinds of foods are are sold, which is ironic because in America, certainly over the course of the 20th century, nobody thought of the kind of foods that you buy in a delicatessen as gourmet.
Right.
So there's a lot of ironies to the whole history of the delicatessen.
What is it that made the deli become so iconic and so much the example of a Jewish eatery?
So for me, the real centrality of the deli came about not specifically because of the food that was served there, but because of the ambiance, because of the type of neighborhood institution that the deli became at a time when, for the most part, Jews were becoming less religiously observant, less interested in keeping kosher, but still very much living within a very Jewish world in which most of their friends and relatives and coworkers were Jewish. And that was partly because of anti-Semitism, and that was partly because Jews tended to be mostly comfortable around other Jews. And so the Jewish deli became this place for the articulation or the expression of a kind of secular Jewish identity.
And then as we move forward, it reaches a peak of popularity. And then with suburbanization, nowadays, the vast majority of Jewish delis are gone.
Right.
There has been a little bit of a resurgence, but what can you say about the decline of the Jewish deli in relation to the nature of American Jewry?
Well, I think World War II is really the turning point. A lot of Jews are serving as GIs in the army, and they are really forced to branch out a little bit in terms of the kind of foods that they eat. And there's this famous saying about eating ham for Uncle Sam. So even those who came from more traditional Jewish homes weren't able to keep kosher in the army. At the same time, they were also sharing their food that was sent to them from home. If you think about the famous sign in Katz's and Other Deli, "Send a salami to your boy in the army."
Right.
They were exposing the non-Jews in their platoons to Jewish food for the first time. After World War II, there's a mass migration of Jews to the south and to the west. But delis in the northeast start to decline. And even for Jews who move to the suburbs around New York or around Chicago or around other major Jewish population centers, there are just fewer delis that are able to survive in the suburbs than there were in the urban areas.
And what do you see moving forward?
Well, as you mentioned, there are delis that have started to open up again. And the newfangled kind of delis tend to have a more 21st century sensibility. So smaller portions of meat. One of the things that we haven't even mentioned is the overstuffed pastrami sandwich that was such a feature of the Jewish deli. So smaller portions of meat and organic vegetables and sodas that they make themselves rather than buying them from a big soda company. Most of the customers, according to the owners who I've interviewed, most of their customers are not Jewish. They're appealing to a much more health-conscious generation that's interested in kind of artisanal food and drink. And so I think it's an open question about whether or not that is the future of the Jewish deli, or whether for Jews who are looking for the more nostalgic experience, whether that really satisfies it. The delis are not going to have the kinds of customers that they had in the old days, where it was the same people eating there, over and over and over again. Even for Orthodox Jews who can only eat foods that are kosher, there are fewer and fewer kosher delis that are left, but there are other kinds of kosher restaurants. There are kosher Chinese restaurants, and there are certainly a lot of Israeli restaurants and Middle Eastern types of restaurants. And so that's become, in some ways, I think, more the Jewish food for the next generation. For example, my children don't have a very strong attachment to Jewish deli. So if you ask them what they think of as Jewish food, they'll probably say falafel and hummus and things like that.
You've failed them.
I have definitely failed them. I've tried, but I have failed them.
All right. Well, there's still time. As we said, one of the things that sort of hurt the deli in America were rising costs of everything, rising costs of ingredients, but also primarily rising costs of real estate. It was very hard for a delicatessen in a city environment to be able to pay its rent when you're just selling sandwiches. You need higher end restaurants to a degree. But one of the other things that can help to mitigate those high costs are reducing the production costs. Nowadays, because pastrami is labor intensive, most delis do not make their own pastrami. There are a few providers that typically make it. Some delis will have it produced to their recipe or to their specifications, but still don't do it in-house. Those mass producers are often taking some shortcuts. They might inject the meat with brine rather than soaking it for an extended period. They might even inject it with liquid smoke instead of actually smoking the meat. This may approximate what a pastrami is supposed to taste like, but it is certainly going to be a lower quality of pastrami than the original, real, smoked after being dry cured, after being brined type of a pastrami. In my next episode, we'll be speaking about a special baked good that sounds like something you're familiar with, but may not be. We will be discussing pizza ebraica, and my guest will be Benedetta Guetta. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed. Got any questions or comments? Please feel free to email me at jewishfoodbook@gmail.com. Please listen, like, and follow wherever you get your podcasts, and I would truly appreciate it if you'd share this with other Jewish food lovers. The theme music you hear is Adir Hu Revisited by Rebbe Soul. Check him out wherever you stream music. And as always, until next time, I wish you b'tei avon.